So, it has come to my attention that a lot of people struggle with getting HTTPS enabled for local development environments, and they also struggle with getting local domain names running. So, I am here to help. For the local domain names aspect of this, it is simply just to change your Etsy host file. So, you're going to want to do something like this, where you're mapping, your usual localhost. Sometimes this ends up being 0.0.0. I can't think of any other IPs it could be. Let me know in the comments if there's something I'm missing, but usually it's just, 127. And then you're gonna want your local domain name. So the other aspect of this, getting the HTTPS stuff to work, for me personally, I use Docker, and with that, I use two different things. One, I have my application stack. So I have a Docker Compose file that holds, if I'm writing a REST API, for instance, it's going to hold the application, or it's going to hold the API, it's going to hold the database, that sort of thing. And on the other side of things, I'm going to have traefik, which is a reverse proxy in this context. And so the two things combine, and they juggle the traffic in such a way where stuff like this can happen, where I am serving locally. Like, this is not a domain name that exists out on any name server out there. It's just locally, and I'm serving it on HTTPS, and all is working. Oh, and there also is a caveat to this, where I'm also using a utility called makecert, which you will need to download. So that utility is here. All the code that I've written for this, by the way, can be found in the description. So I'm just going to breeze through this as fast as I can. But I also just recommend looking at this, downloading this, and looking at the code after this video. But this video should give you the rough idea on everything you need. So first off, you're going to want to go and put in your Etsy host file. You will need root privileges for this. You're going to want to put in your Etsy host file your intended domain name. So for me, that was api.edgar.dev. Next up, you're going to go and you're going to make a traefik Docker Compose file. So ignore this for a second. We are in the wrong window. So it's going to look like this. Now, for me personally, I was kind of bored one day and I decided to go and set up a Docker socket proxy. This container, you don't exactly need. The only thing it's really doing is it's just making a little REST API on top of Docker socket, so that way nothing nefarious can happen with the permissions, but you're developing locally, you don't really need it. This was just kind of like to prove a point. But what you will need is you will need this traefik container here. And you will also need this networks bit here. The networks bit will go and stand up a network called proxy, and that network will be used later in our application stack. So what we're doing here is we are serving traffic on port 80 and 443. So both the port, yeah. So we're serving traffic on port 80 and 443. We are also making sure that we volume these particular things, we mount these particular things, this certs folder, the config files. We also want to put in these labels here. Now this will actually enable traefik for us. It will create an admin panel that we can access on port 80. So without further ado, let's get into the configuration settings. So with this, you're going to want to make since we're working locally, you're going to want to set your API insecure. You're going to want to enable the dashboard. You want your entry points. This bit is very important to have some sort of name. So for me, I chose web and web secure, and I also put it to 80 and 443, which is the usual ports for HTTP and HTTPS, what your browser understands by default. Those two ports are going to be used to say, hey, from my application stack, if you see any sort of traffic from my browser that is hitting a domain name that is referenced in my application stack on that port, I want traefik to do something with it. I also have a preference for like JSON formatted logs and debug level stuff, local, do whatever you want. If you're not using the socket proxy, this is set to the Docker socket. You can read more about that if you go to the traefik documentation itself. It's just the default, really. You're gonna want also this file here. You're gonna want to reference the dynamic config, and you are also going to want to say in the Docker provider, you're going to want to specify the network that you're using, which in our case is proxy, as that was set up over here. So we got the traefik config out of the way. Dynamic config is going to be the certificates that we are going to make in a second. The certificates, for those, you're going to use the make cert utility, which is what we downloaded here. You have a few different ways of downloading this. You can use either releases, you can use Homebrew, you can use maybe Choco if you're on Windows. I don't really develop on Windows. But you're going to run this make cert install, and then you're going to run something akin to this, but with your specific application domain name that you wanted. So when you get done with it all, you should end up with something like this, where you have your hang on, let me double check these files. Where you have your key and you have your cert in here, and then you're going to put those files into your dynamic config. For me, in case someone else out there is following this and they're also running Ubuntu or some other Linux distro, you may also need to have a Docker file set up that fixes the permissions on your system. And fixes the permissions inside your container, so that way it runs how you'd expect. Otherwise, traefik is going to hit like all sorts of weird permissions issues. This is not something you have to worry about if you're working with Windows or OS X, because with them, what's happening is Docker is running within a virtual machine. So it's actually fixing all of your permissions problems inside that virtual machine. But if you're running Docker Engine on top of or inside of a Linux operating system, it runs it exactly from the Linux operating system. So your permissions and whatnot become very important because you no longer have a virtual machine juggling all that for you. So with both these certs set up and the traefik container successfully running, with that will look something like this, where you have the admin panel actually running. With that set up, you're going to set up your application stack. Now this next bit is going to look way more intense than it actually is, but bear with me. This is just a personal project I'm working on. You won't need 99% of what's in here. What's important is that for the service that you're trying to go and expose, so the service you're trying to do something like, this api.edgar.dev thing, you're going to need two major things. You're going to need these labels, and you're going to need the networks. So what you're going to do here is you're going to enable traefik. You're going to go and set up some middleware that says that you want to redirect your the traffic that you get. So then you're going to say, hey, I am going to go and this domain name, or if I hit this domain name on api.edgar.dev and it's on port 80, I want to redirect it over to port 443. And also, I want to serve traffic from port 8080 from inside this container. Is here. If we look at the Docker file that is running this container, we see that we are exposing port 8080. Now, it is very important that only within your Docker file are you exposing port 8080. You don't want to do this. You don't want to have like any ports or whatnot getting exposed out here, you know, in this. You don't want to do anything like this, is what I'm trying to say. Yeah, you don't want to do that. Admittedly, maybe you could get away with something like this, but I have never written this. I've never tried it. But maybe that can work as well. Yeah, and the other section of this that you want to make sure you do is you want to go and make sure that you are adding that container to the proxy network. And the proxy network is the same one that is being spun up by traefik. But when you do this, when you add in this networks keyword, you say, hey, you know that default network that you spin up, that Docker Compose has spun up for you? You say, hey, I don't want that anymore. I don't want that. I'm going to specify my own networks. You have to re-add this container to the default network. And what the default network does and how it is used is it makes it so that way when you're within the context of this API container, you can reference something like persistent DB as your database. So your database host would be persistent DB instead of, you know, some arbitrary IP address or what have you. And if you know, if your API container isn't in the default network anymore, what ends up happening is when you try and reference persistent DB, you get something like misbehaving server or some random DNS error. Actually quite confusing when you hit it. So the other thing, the last thing that you need for this, if you made it this far, I'm very proud of you. But the last thing that you need for this is you need to go and add in this networks proxy external thing here, which simply says, hey, in this Docker Compose file, we are also going to be referencing the already pre-made external network with the name of proxy. And with everything working well together, you should see something like this, where you have, you know, if I try visit this, I will be redirected to HTTPS, and my application is being served to me. I get also the traefik dashboard. I hope that helps. Please subscribe, like this video, check out my code. Yeah, that's all I got.